For the hybrid portion of this week, we're going to go over some issues in markets, where markets fail, and some limitations of markets. Most of it will mirror what's in your book, but I'll add in a little bit of new information. I do this so that you can kind of understand what's going on in the book and to try to clear up any confusion by using this online lecture to YouTube. So there are going to be two new definitions that we'll use. One, as you'll see in the table, is rivalrous. If something is rivalrous, it means that if I am consuming the good, nobody else can simultaneously consume it. So for example, a concert ticket, if you're using it, if you use it for admission, nobody else can use it. If you're consuming it right now, nobody within reason can consume it at this same point in time. Something that is not rivalrous would be like a highway. If I'm using the highway right now, you can also use the highway right now. A public park, if I'm using the public park right now, you can use the public park right now, so it would be considered non-rivalrous. Rivalrous will mean if I'm consuming it, nobody else can simultaneously consume it at the same time. The other definition that you'll see, or word, up in the table is excludable. And this basically means, is there private ownership rights around the good? And so in the table we've put yes and no. The easiest good to remember is one that is both excludable, meaning somebody owns it, there's private ownership rights, and it is rivalrous, meaning that if I'm consuming it now, nobody else can. This is, since there's private ownership rights and you can, if you're consuming it right now, nobody else can, this is known as a private good. And in the example, we mentioned concert tickets, an apple, some sort of item. Somebody owns the item right now, nobody else can. A good, and we're not really going to get into it, that is excludable, meaning there are private ownership rights around it. But if I'm using it, so can everybody else, so it's non-rivalrous, would be what your book calls a club good. And they cite Netflix. If you think of a homeowners association, the community pool, you have to be a member of the homeowners association to use the pool. That's considered a club good. We're not really going to focus on these in public policy, so I'm going to leave that blank so as not to cause confusion. This is something that's not usually regulated or dealt with by government. Goods that are susceptible to market failures or limitations of market fall into the non-excludable, meaning nobody owns them. There's no private ownership rights around them. These types of goods that are non-excludable tend to suffer from market failures or limitations from markets. The first good that's non-excludable but is rivalrous, meaning that if I'm using that good right now, you cannot use that good or that item, goes in the upper right quadrant, known as commons goods. Again, this means that there's no ownership rights around the property within, or around the good within reason. And if I'm using the good right now, you cannot simultaneously use it. So an example of this would be free printing paper in a lab. If I'm using 10 sheets of free paper in the library's computer lab, well, it's rivalrous because I'm using these 10 sheets. You cannot simultaneously use those 10 sheets. And within reason, nobody owns that good. I don't own it. You don't own it. I guess you could say the university owns it, but it's essentially free. In public policy, we tend to see this with ocean fisheries, especially with cod, swordfish, tuna, salmon, etc. If you're on a boat and you're pulling out 15 codfish to sell at market, I, as a competitor or other fishermen, cannot simultaneously remove those same 10 or 15 codfish. But nobody owns the cod that's swimming out in the ocean. There's no property rights around them, but they are rivalrous. If I'm harvesting the cod out of the ocean, you cannot simultaneously harvest that same cod. So that's why it is, yes, rivalrous, but no, not excludable, and these are called commons goods. Goods that are non-excludable, but basically allow everybody to consume them, so they're non-rivalrous, are public goods. And your book uses the classic example of national defense. Or you can also say public parks. Within reason, nobody owns national defense. Within reason, nobody owns a public park. I mean, technically the government does, but there's no private ownership rights around national defense. There's no private ownership rights around public parks. So they are not excludable. So they fall under the no, they're not excludable column. And they're non-rivalrous, which means that if I'm using national defense right now and getting protection from it, so can you. You can simultaneously consume that good. If I'm using a public park, you can also use a public park at the same time. Again, these goods that tend to suffer from market failures with commons goods like free printing paper or cod fisheries, the market failure, people acting in their rational self-interest, the market failure tends to be of over-harvesting or overuse. Public goods failure tends to happen with their provision. In the private sector, with no government intervention, with a market working, private citizens and businesses probably would not provide public parks. They probably would not provide national defense. There's not really any kind of profit motive behind that. Therefore, it doesn't get provided. So the government steps in and provides it for you, usually through your taxpayer dollars. So the key thing to know are these types of goods, and we'll see more of these, especially next week with environmental policies, but the market failures tend to occur with commons goods and public goods. Again, the market failure with commons goods is they're overused, and we see this a lot in environmental policy along with public goods. Clean air is also thought of as a public good, and when you have factories operating in a free market system without any government regulation or intervention, then the incentive is to pollute the clean air, and so the market failure there is in the provision of clean air. How are we going to provide that? Well, the government usually will have to step in or some other mechanism. Other market failures to know and how they affect policy for the upcoming course. The key ones are one, monopolies. And again, market failures or limitations to markets, we are assuming that we're operating in a system with no government intervention, kind of like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, laissez-faire, and people, business entities acting in their rational self-interest. There can be instances where free markets create monopolies. One example of this we saw in the 1990s with Microsoft. The government called Microsoft a monopoly because they held over 90% of the software market. After years and years of competition in a free market system, they emerged as the monopoly entity and then eventually had to be regulated. This was a failure of the market. Your local cable companies, if they can capture a local market, they are considered a monopoly. That would be a market failure. Your bookstore, I believe it's E4, tends to be a monopoly in the campus bookstore business. The campus food dining services is typically Sodexo. They've operated and they've won over the market. So this is a situation where a market has failed by creating a monopoly. More typically, especially with environmental policy, we will deal with market failures in the terms of negative externalities. Negative externalities are negative effects that a third party receives because two other parties engaging in business, or one other party engaging in business, is creating a problem. The clearest example of negative externalities is if you look in the Rust Belt, cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Toledo. They had a lot of smokestacks, a lot of factories, and they polluted the air. Well, they were operating in Detroit's case, Michigan, in Cleveland and Toledo's case in Ohio. They were doing business and producing manufacturing goods and also pollution. However, when that pollution got up in the air and into the jet stream, it would flow over to, say, Pennsylvania, New York, into Canada. Those individuals in Canada, in New York, and Pennsylvania who don't live in Ohio or Michigan or anywhere near those factories and likely don't own those factories or do any kind of business with those particular factories suffer the cost in terms of poor health outcomes, asthma, bad drinking water, bad air, bad breathing air, and those negative impacts are called negative externalities. Those individuals in New York, Pennsylvania had no say in the operations of the factories in Michigan and Ohio, but they suffer from those consequences. And we'll see how to alleviate these next week with the environmental policies. Other times when markets fail is when there's a situation where there's information asymmetry. Two parties engaging in business. Hold on one second. Let me pause this and I'll answer the phone and we'll do post second video.